In the summer of 1960, as the Cold War accelerated beyond Europe and into the collapsing architecture of empire, the newly independent Congo became the site of one of the most chaotic, violent, and consequential power struggles of the 20th century. A crisis born not simply from decolonization, but from the collision of global ideology, corporate interest, and institutional collapse. Because when Belgium abruptly granted independence after decades of brutal colonial rule, it left behind a vast country with almost no trained administrators, a fragile army, artificial borders, and an economy dominated by foreign mining interests. And into this vacuum stepped Patrice Lumumba, a charismatic nationalist who spoke openly of sovereignty, unity, and control over Congo's immense natural wealth. Ideas that resonated deeply with a population emerging from exploitation, but immediately alarmed Western governments, who interpreted any assertive nationalism in the early 1960s through the rigid lens of Cold War alignment. And while Lumumba was not a communist, he refused to subordinate Congolese independence to either bloc, a position that proved untenable in a world increasingly defined by binary choices. And within days of independence, the Congolese army mutinied against its Belgian officers. Belgian troops intervened under the pretext of protecting citizens and property, and the mineral-rich province of Katanga declared secession under the leadership of Moise Tshombe, backed quietly by Belgian corporate interests, determined to retain control over uranium, copper, and cobalt resources, vital to Western industry and military power, including materials that had already played a decisive role in the atomic age. And as Congo fragmented almost immediately into competing centers of authority, Lumumba appealed to the international community for assistance, first to the United Nations, and then, when UN forces refused to suppress Katanga's secession, to the Soviet Union, a move that transformed a post-colonial crisis into a full-scale Cold War emergency in the eyes of Washington, because the prospect of Soviet influence in Central Africa, near critical mineral supplies and key air routes, was perceived as an unacceptable strategic threat. And it was at this moment that the Congo crisis shifted from instability to intervention, as the United Nations deployed one of its largest peacekeeping missions to date, attempting to stabilize the country while simultaneously avoiding direct confrontation with either superpower, a neutrality that satisfied no one and exposed the limits of international mediation in a polarized world. And behind the scenes, the Central Intelligence Agency began treating Lumumba not as a legitimate leader navigating impossible conditions, but as a liability to be neutralized, because his rhetoric, his appeal to Moscow, and his refusal to align fully with Western interests placed him outside the acceptable boundaries of Cold War leadership. And as cables and memoranda circulated within Washington, framing Lumumba as unstable, dangerous, and susceptible to communist influence, plans were discussed not merely to remove him from power, but to eliminate him entirely, reflecting the intensity of fear that defined early Cold War policymaking. And meanwhile, within Congo, the balance of power shifted rapidly as Joseph Mobutu, a young army chief with close ties to Western intelligence, positioned himself as a stabilizing force, staging a coup that placed Lumumba under house arrest while proclaiming neutrality, a maneuver that effectively sidelined the prime minister while preserving a facade of legality. And as Lumumba attempted to escape to rally support in the east, he was captured, transferred, and ultimately delivered into the hands of his enemies in Katanga, where he was executed in January 1961, under circumstances that would later become emblematic of Cold War brutality and deniability, his death concealed, denied, and obfuscated for years while the forces that had benefited from his removal consolidated their position. And Lumumba's assassination sent shockwaves across Africa and the developing world, transforming him into a martyr of anti-imperialism, and exposing the lethal stakes of Cold War alignment for newly independent states. And yet his death did not resolve the Congo crisis, but intensified it, because the removal of a unifying national figure deepened fragmentation, prolonged civil war, and opened the door to years of proxy conflict involving mercenaries, rival governments, regional actors, and foreign intelligence services, all operating within a single collapsing state. And as fighting spread and governance disintegrated, the Congo became a laboratory of Cold War intervention, where ideology was less important than control, access, and denial, and where the rhetoric of stability masked a reality of continuous violence. And over time, Mobutu emerged as the dominant figure, backed by Western powers, who viewed his authoritarian rule as preferable to chaos or Soviet influence, even as corruption hollowed out the state and repression became routine, illustrating once again how Cold War priorities consistently elevated short-term alignment over long-term legitimacy. And in this sense, the Congo crisis was not an aberration, but a concentrated expression of the era's logic, demonstrating how decolonization without institutional preparation, combined with superpower rivalry, could destroy the possibility of democratic development almost as soon as it appeared. And as the crisis unfolded through the early 1960s, it revealed that Africa was not a peripheral theater, but a central front in the Cold War, where the struggle was not over ideology alone, but over resources, influence, and the future shape of the post-colonial world. And as Congo descended further into conflict, the lines between internal collapse and external manipulation blurred beyond recognition, setting the stage for years of instability whose origins lay not in a single decision or actor, but in the convergence of colonial neglect, nationalist aspiration, and Cold War fear, all colliding within one of the largest and richest countries on the continent. As the shock of Lumumba's death reverberated across the Congo and the wider world, the country slid deeper into a multi-sided conflict that exposed the full anatomy of Cold War intervention in a post-colonial state. Because his removal did not settle the question of authority, but shattered what little national cohesion remained, leaving rival governments, regional strongmen, and foreign-backed factions competing for legitimacy and control. And in the immediate aftermath, the United Nations mission found itself trapped between mandates and realities, tasked with preserving Congo's territorial integrity, while lacking both the political consensus and military authority to decisively suppress secession or restore centralized rule. A paralysis that emboldened Katanga's leadership and the foreign mercenaries defending it, many of whom were veterans of colonial wars motivated by pay, ideology, or the promise of continued Western access to strategic minerals. And, as Katanga remained effectively outside central control, fighting spread to other regions, particularly in the east, where Lumumba's supporters regrouped and declared rival administrations, turning the Congo into a patchwork of competing sovereignties rather than a functioning state. And this fragmentation intensified superpower anxiety because it created openings for external influence under the guise of assistance. And while Soviet involvement remained limited and largely symbolic after Lumumba's death, the perception of potential communist expansion continued to shape Western actions, justifying deeper involvement in Congolese affairs. And behind-the-scenes intelligence agencies worked to ensure that emerging power centers aligned with their interests, channeling money, advice, and logistical support to figures deemed reliable, even as the humanitarian situation deteriorated and civilian populations bore the cost of endless fighting, displacement, and economic collapse. And the Congolese army itself, poorly trained and riven by factional loyalty, oscillated between mutiny and repression, reinforcing the sense that order could only be imposed through force rather than consent. And within this chaos, Mobutu maneuvered carefully, presenting himself as the only actor capable of preventing total disintegration, cultivating Western support by emphasizing his anti-communism, while gradually expanding his personal control over the military and state institutions. And this consolidation was neither immediate nor uncontested, but it was facilitated by the exhaustion of other factions and the willingness of external powers to tolerate authoritarian methods in exchange for predictability. And as the crisis dragged on through the early 1960s, the Congo became synonymous with instability in international discourse, a warning example invoked whenever decolonization was discussed without adequate preparation or safeguards. And yet this framing obscured the degree to which instability was actively produced and sustained by foreign interference. Because the competition to shape outcomes often mattered more than the well-being of the Congolese population, or the viability of democratic governance. And in this environment, violence became normalized as a tool of politics, with coups, counter-coups, and military campaigns replacing negotiation and institution building. And the longer the crisis persisted, the narrower the range of acceptable solutions became, until strongman rule emerged not as a temporary expedient, but as the default outcome. And this evolution reflected a broader Cold War pattern in which newly independent states were pressured to choose sides before they had the capacity to govern themselves, and punished when they attempted to chart an independent course. And as Congo's turmoil continued, its immense natural wealth remained both the prize and the curse of the conflict, attracting constant external attention while fueling internal rivalries, ensuring that peace was always provisional and contingent. And by the mid-1960s, it was increasingly clear that the Congo crisis was no longer a transitional episode, but a prolonged condition, one that had transformed a hopeful moment of independence into a cautionary tale about how global rivalry could hollow out sovereignty, distort political development, and lock a nation into cycles of violence whose origins lay far beyond its own borders. By 1964, the Congo crisis entered a new and even more volatile phase as the country's unresolved fractures erupted into widespread rebellion, revealing how thoroughly the collapse of authority after independence had transformed political conflict into armed struggle. Because in the absence of legitimate institutions, power increasingly flowed to those who could mobilize force, control territory, and attract external backing. And in the eastern regions, a series of uprisings collectively known as the Simba Rebellion drew strength from popular frustration, Lumumba's martyrdom, and promises of radical transformation, blending nationalist rhetoric with local grievances in a way that alarmed Western governments, who once again interpreted disorder through the prism of Cold War escalation. And as rebel forces captured towns, executed perceived enemies, and threatened key infrastructure, the crisis took on an international dimension that went far beyond internal Congolese politics, prompting urgent deliberations in Washington and Brussels about the risk of losing influence in Central Africa. And these fears were amplified by the symbolic power of the rebellion, because images of Western hostages held by insurgents and reports of atrocities fed a narrative of chaos that justified direct intervention, and so foreign military involvement escalated under the banner of humanitarian rescue, most notably through joint operations involving Western aircraft and elite troops that retook strategic cities while leaving the deeper causes of rebellion unaddressed, reinforcing the pattern in which force substituted for political settlement. And this intervention further entrenched the perception among Congolese factions that external actors would ultimately decide outcomes, incentivizing alignment with foreign interests rather than compromise with domestic rivals. And in this environment, Mobutu's position strengthened dramatically because he was able to present himself as the indispensable intermediary between Congo's internal chaos and the external powers determined to prevent a perceived communist breakthrough. And with their support, he gradually consolidated authority, sidelining civilian politicians, suppressing rebel movements, and centralizing control over the military. And this consolidation culminated in 1965 when Mobutu seized power outright, ending the formal crisis of competing governments but inaugurating a new phase of authoritarian rule that would last for decades. And this outcome was celebrated in Western capitals as the restoration of stability. Yet stability in this context meant the freezing of political life rather than its renewal, as opposition was criminalized. Corruption became systemic, and the state was reshaped around personal loyalty rather than institutional capacity, and the Congo, renamed Zaire, became a textbook example of Cold War clientelism, where geopolitical alignment shielded a regime from scrutiny, even as economic mismanagement and repression hollowed out society. And the long-term consequences of this arrangement were profound, because while Mobutu's rule temporarily reduced overt conflict, it did so by suppressing rather than resolving the underlying tensions created by colonial extraction, rushed decolonization, and foreign intervention, ensuring that instability was deferred rather than eliminated. And for the Congolese population, the promise of independence faded into a reality of poverty, insecurity, and political exclusion, while the country's immense resources continued to flow outward, benefiting elites and foreign partners more than the nation as a whole. And within the broader Cold War landscape, the Congo Crisis thus became a formative episode, shaping how superpowers approached Africa by reinforcing the belief that strongmen were preferable to uncertain democratic experiments, a belief that would influence policy across the continent for years to come. And this belief carried its own costs, because it entrenched governance models that prioritized loyalty over competence and repression over legitimacy, weakening states from within and making them more vulnerable to future crises once external support waned. And as the Cold War progressed, the Congolese case was rarely revisited with honesty by those who had shaped its outcome, because doing so would have required acknowledging that the very interventions justified as safeguards against instability had helped create a system in which violence and corruption became structural. And yet for historians and observers, the trajectory from independence to dictatorship revealed a consistent pattern that the Congo Crisis was not resolved by the removal of individual figures or the defeat of specific rebellions, but was transformed into a long-term condition shaped by the initial decision to subordinate Congolese self-determination to external strategic priorities. And in this sense, the events of the early 1960s were not merely a turbulent beginning, but the foundation of a political order whose fragility would re-emerge with devastating force long after the Cold War itself had ended, underscoring how deeply the crisis had reshaped the country's fate and how inseparable its legacy was from the global struggle that had turned Congo into a battlefield of interests rather than a sovereign state. As Mobutu's rule solidified in the late 1960s, the Congo Crisis appeared on the surface to have ended, but in reality, it had merely been frozen into a new configuration that concealed instability beneath the appearance of order, because the structures that emerged were designed not to represent society, but to control it. And this control was sustained through a combination of patronage, repression, and foreign support that insulated the regime from accountability while steadily eroding the state's capacity to function independently. And in the Cold War context, this arrangement was considered acceptable, even desirable, Because Mobutu positioned himself as a reliable anti-communist ally in a region still viewed through the lens of ideological containment, hosting Western interests, cooperating with intelligence services, and projecting influence into neighboring conflicts where superpower rivalry continued to play out, and this alignment granted him extraordinary latitude, allowing corruption to metastasize into the organizing principle of governance as state resources were siphoned off to secure loyalty and reward compliance, hollowing out institutions that had never been given the chance to mature. And for ordinary Congolese citizens, the legacy of the crisis thus shifted from open warfare to chronic dysfunction, as infrastructure decayed, public services collapsed, and political participation disappeared, replaced by a system in which survival depended on proximity to power rather than rights or law. And this transformation underscored a central outcome of the Congo Crisis, that the Cold War did not merely intervene in moments of conflict, but reshaped political trajectories by determining which forms of authority would be sustained and which would be extinguished. And in Congo, the extinguished possibility was democratic sovereignty, sacrificed early and repeatedly in favor of expedient control, and over time, this sacrifice became normalized, both domestically and internationally, as generations grew up knowing no alternative and external partners adjusted their expectations to the realities of authoritarian rule. And yet, beneath this normalization, the unresolved foundations of the crisis remained intact, because the grievances that had fueled rebellion in the early 1960s were never addressed, only suppressed, and the country's immense wealth continued to attract predatory interest without generating broad-based development, ensuring that resentment accumulated silently even as overt resistance was crushed. And this accumulation mattered because it meant that stability was always conditional, dependent on continuous external backing and internal coercion, a model that functioned only so long as Cold War priorities aligned and resources flowed. And when those conditions began to change in the late Cold War period, the fragility of the system became increasingly apparent, and from a historical perspective, the Congo Crisis thus stands as a demonstration of how the Cold War's emphasis on alignment over legitimacy produced political orders that were inherently brittle, capable of enforcing obedience, but incapable of sustaining consent. And this brittleness would later reveal itself with devastating clarity when the structures built during the crisis collapsed under new pressures, unleashing violence on a scale that traced its origins directly back to the unresolved choices of the early 1960s. And in this sense, the crisis did not end with Mobutu's ascent, but entered a latent phase, embedded in the political economy and social fabric of the country, waiting for the moment when the external constraints that had held it in check would weaken, allowing the deferred consequences of Cold War intervention to re-emerge with force. As the Cold War moved into its later decades, the Congo's apparent calm masked a deeper historical reckoning that had been postponed rather than resolved, because the political order that emerged from the Congo Crisis depended entirely on the continuation of external support and internal coercion, leaving it structurally incapable of adapting to change or absorbing dissent without violence. And this dependence became increasingly problematic as global priorities shifted, and the rigid bipolar discipline of the Cold War began to loosen, exposing regimes like Mobutu's to pressures they had never been designed to withstand. And while Western governments continued to tolerate his rule for strategic reasons, the erosion of institutional capacity accelerated, transforming the state into a hollow shell whose primary function was extraction rather than governance. And this hollowing out had profound social consequences as education systems deteriorated, infrastructure collapsed, and the gap between rulers and ruled widened into a chasm that could no longer be bridged by patronage alone. And in this environment, the legacy of the early 1960s resurfaced, not as memory, but as structure, because the patterns established during the crisis, the use of force over consent, the privileging of foreign interests over national cohesion, and the sidelining of political legitimacy, had become embedded norms that shaped behavior at every level of society. And when new conflicts emerged, they did so along the fault lines created decades earlier, revealing how deeply the Cold War had reshaped the Congo's internal dynamics. And from a broader historical perspective, this trajectory challenged the notion that the Congo Crisis was a contained episode, because its effects extended far beyond its formal end, influencing regional stability, migration, and conflict in Central Africa long after superpower rivalry had faded. And this extension underscored a recurring theme of Cold War history, that interventions justified as temporary measures often produced permanent transformations whose consequences unfolded on timelines far longer than those imagined by policymakers. And in the Congo, this reality was particularly stark because the crisis coincided with the birth of the state itself, meaning that the formative years in which institutions and norms might have taken root were instead dominated by violence, manipulation, and external control, leaving behind a political culture oriented toward survival rather than development. And as historians trace the lineage of later catastrophes back to this period, it became increasingly clear that the Congo Crisis represented not a failure of decolonization alone, but a failure of the international system to allow genuine sovereignty to emerge in a strategically valuable space. And this failure was not accidental, but the product of deliberate choices made under the pressure of Cold War fear. Choices that prioritized denial of influence over the construction of legitimacy. And in this sense, the Congo Crisis stands as one of the Cold War's most consequential lessons, demonstrating how the suppression of political possibility at a nation's birth can reverberate across generations, shaping outcomes long after the global struggle that motivated the intervention has disappeared, leaving behind a legacy defined not by ideological victory, but by enduring instability rooted in the unresolved contradictions of the era. As the Cold War drew toward its final phase, the Congo's trajectory exposed with increasing clarity how deeply the crisis of the early 1960s had reordered the country's political DNA, because the structures erected to secure alignment and control had crowded out any capacity for renewal, leaving a state that could neither reform itself nor respond constructively to pressure without unraveling. And this rigidity became fatal as the geopolitical environment that had sustained Mobutu's regime began to erode, with superpower priorities shifting and tolerance for overtly predatory client states diminishing. And when external backing weakened the contradictions embedded since independence surfaced rapidly, revealing a society burdened by unresolved grievances, regional cleavages, and a political economy designed for extraction rather than inclusion. And this exposure was not sudden, but cumulative, the product of decades in which authority had been exercised through coercion and patronage, while legitimacy had been deferred indefinitely. And in this sense, the Congo Crisis did not simply precede later instability, but actively structured it, determining who held power, how it was maintained, and what forms of opposition were possible. And as scholars and policymakers reassessed the Cold War's African theater, the Congolese case stood out as a stark example of how the prioritization of strategic denial over political development could hollow out a state from its inception, producing an order that appeared durable only because it was frozen by external constraints. And once those constraints loosened, the accumulated stresses found violent expression, tracing a direct line back to the moment when decolonization collided with superpower rivalry. And this line underscored a broader truth about the Cold War, that its most enduring impacts were often felt where sovereignty was weakest and intervention easiest, transforming moments of transition into long-term traps. And for the Congo, the trap was set early, when independence arrived without institutions and was immediately subsumed by competing external agendas, leaving little space for endogenous solutions to emerge. And the result was a political landscape in which crisis became normalized and reform became synonymous with risk, discouraging the very processes that might have produced stability. And as the Cold War ended, the international community confronted the limits of its earlier choices, discovering that the costs of intervention, deferred for decades, could not be avoided indefinitely, and that the legacy of the Congo Crisis was not confined to a single era, but embedded in the continuing struggles of a state whose formative years had been shaped by fear, rivalry, and the systematic subordination of legitimacy to control, ensuring that the Cold War's imprint would remain visible long after its ideological battles had faded from the global stage. In retrospect, the Congo Crisis stands as one of the Cold War's most revealing episodes precisely because it compressed so many of the era's defining contradictions into a single national catastrophe, showing how the rhetoric of self-determination coexisted with a willingness to override it when strategic interests were perceived to be at risk, and how the language of stability masked a deeper acceptance of repression as an acceptable substitute for legitimacy. And this acceptance shaped not only the Congo's fate, but the broader patterns of engagement that governed superpower behavior across the developing world, because once the precedent was set that post-colonial governments could be removed, reshaped, or sustained based on alignment rather than consent, the boundaries of sovereignty became porous and conditional. And in the Congo, this conditionality was felt immediately and continuously, as domestic political struggles were never allowed to resolve themselves organically, but were instead filtered through external calculations about resources, ideology, and denial. And the result was a political environment in which compromise was punished, moderation was marginalized, and force became the primary currency of power, leaving behind a state whose institutions were designed to serve rulers rather than society. And this design choice carried a temporal dimension that Cold War planners rarely accounted for, because institutions built for control are ill-suited to adaptation. And when circumstances change, they tend to collapse rather than evolve. And this tendency explains why the apparent stability achieved after the crisis proved so fragile once external constraints weakened, revealing the depth of damage inflicted during the formative years of independence. And as analysts traced the roots of later upheavals back to the early 1960s, the Congo Crisis emerged not as a discrete failure, but as a foundational distortion, one that redirected the country's political development onto a path defined by extraction, coercion, and dependency. And this redirection had regional implications as well, because instability radiated outward, affecting neighboring states and shaping Central Africa's security landscape for decades, demonstrating how Cold War interventions in one country could generate cascading effects far beyond their original scope. And in this sense, the Congo Crisis challenges any attempt to separate local history from global rivalry, because it reveals how deeply intertwined they were, and how decisions made in distant capitals could determine the life chances of millions, not through overt conquest, but through the quiet manipulation of power structures at moments of vulnerability. And as the Cold War faded from memory, the Congolese experience remained as a testament to the costs of treating sovereignty as negotiable and legitimacy as optional, a testament that underscores how the era's most enduring legacies were often created not by grand confrontations between superpowers, but by the systematic erosion of political possibility in places deemed strategically expendable, leaving behind states whose struggles continue to reflect the unresolved contradictions of the age that shaped them. Ultimately, the Congo Crisis forces a reckoning with the deeper mechanics of the Cold War itself, because it reveals how an international system organized around fear and denial could convert moments of emancipation into sites of prolonged suffering, and how the promise of independence could be hollowed out almost immediately when it intersected with strategic anxiety and economic interest. And in the Congolese case, this hollowing out was especially devastating because it occurred at the very birth of the state, imprinting patterns of power that proved extraordinarily difficult to reverse, as authority was centralized not to govern, but to control, and legitimacy was displaced by alignment as the primary criterion of international support. And this displacement mattered because it reshaped incentives at every level of politics, encouraging leaders to seek foreign backing rather than domestic consent, and teaching populations that political change would be met not with negotiation, but with repression. And over time, these lessons became self-reinforcing, producing a political culture in which violence was normalized and institutions were stripped of meaning, serving as instruments of extraction rather than vehicles of collective purpose. And from this perspective, the Congo Crisis was less a deviation from Cold War norms than a distilled expression of them, demonstrating how the logic of containment could override the logic of state building, and how the prioritization of short-term stability could undermine the very foundations required for long-term peace. And as subsequent generations confronted the consequences of these choices, they did so within structures that had been deliberately shaped to prevent genuine accountability, leaving reformers with few options other than confrontation or collapse. And this constraint explains why later attempts to stabilize the Congo repeatedly failed to produce durable outcomes, because they addressed symptoms rather than origins, focusing on security arrangements while leaving untouched the historical legacy of a state whose sovereignty had been compromised from the outset. And in this sense, the Congo Crisis continues to resonate not only as a historical episode, but as a cautionary framework for understanding how external intervention at moments of vulnerability can lock societies into trajectories of instability that persist long after the original rationale has disappeared. And as the Cold War recedes further into the past, the Congolese experience stands as a stark reminder that the costs of subordinating legitimacy to strategy are rarely immediate, but almost always cumulative, unfolding across decades and generations, shaping lives and futures in ways that defy easy resolution. And it is this cumulative impact, rather than any single decision or actor, that defines the true legacy of the Congo Crisis as one of the Cold War's most consequential and least reversible interventions. In the end, the Congo Crisis remains one of the Cold War's clearest demonstrations of how global power struggles could devastate newly independent states not through overt conquest, but through sustained distortion of political possibility, because what unfolded after 1960 was not simply a series of unfortunate events, but a structural outcome shaped by the convergence of colonial abandonment, strategic paranoia, and the systematic privileging of control over legitimacy. And once that convergence took hold, it proved extraordinarily resilient, reproducing itself through institutions designed to suppress accountability and through international relationships that rewarded compliance rather than governance, ensuring that the crisis would not resolve, but metastasize into a long-term condition. And while individual leaders rose and fell, the underlying logic remained intact, teaching successive generations that sovereignty was conditional, that authority flowed from force and external recognition rather than popular consent, and that violence was an acceptable an often necessary instrument of politics, and this lesson was among the most destructive inheritances of the Cold War, because it hollowed out the social contract at the moment it might have been formed, leaving behind a state that existed in name, but lacked the internal coherence required to sustain peace or development. And as later conflicts erupted and humanitarian disasters unfolded, they did so within a framework whose origins traced directly back to the early 1960s, revealing how the choices made during the Congo Crisis had foreclosed alternative paths and locked the country into cycles of instability that were never purely domestic. And from a historical standpoint, this trajectory forces a reassessment of Cold War success itself, because if strategic denial was achieved at the cost of state collapse and generational suffering, then the metric of victory becomes deeply questionable, and the Congo stands as evidence that the Cold War's most profound failures were often invisible at the time, obscured by the language of stability and alignment, while their consequences accumulated silently beneath the surface. And it is this delayed reckoning that defines the crisis's enduring significance, because it shows that interventions justified as temporary safeguards can reshape societies in ways that persist long after the geopolitical context has vanished, leaving behind legacies that no peacekeeping mission or policy reversal can easily undo. And in this sense, the Congo Crisis is not merely a chapter in Cold War history, but a warning embedded within it, illustrating how the suppression of political legitimacy at moments of national birth can echo across decades, transforming independence into endurance and sovereignty into survival, and reminding us that the most lasting battles of the Cold War were often those fought quietly, whose outcomes were written not in treaties or headlines, but in the long, unresolved struggles of nations caught at the intersection of fear, power, and history.